NTV Television Network presents The Other Day, Current Era, 1971. Translation and voiceover by BMI Russian. Good evening. You're watching episode 11 of our series The Other Day, 1961 to 1991, Current Era. Events, people, and occurrences which defined a lifestyle. Things that we can't imagine ourselves without, let alone comprehend. Today we're covering 1971. Self-serve stores, Angela Davis, the very first Ladas, new leadership in East Germany and Poland, badminton, the beginning of Jewish migration, student construction brigades, the first available French perfumes. Commenting we have screenwriter and actress Renata Litvinova, economic expert Yegor Gaidar, political expert Sergei Karaganov. The ritual of televised New Year's celebrations is further honed and perfected. From this point on, the clock ticking, the national anthem, and the little blue light were preceded by a New Year's address on behalf of the General Secretary of the Communist Party Central Committee to the people of the Soviet Union. The General Secretary's appearance on the screen was always a sign to be fully prepared, with only a few minutes left to fix your hair, mince the salad, and uncork the drinks. People would drink to the old year while glancing at the nation's leader, to then immediately drink to the new year once the clock starts ringing. 100 years had gone by since the first Russian or by then Soviet champagne had appeared. Such an inconceivable topographical combination was par for the course as far as the people were concerned. However, rumor had it that this annoyed French winemakers and hampered foreign trade operations. That said, none of the alternative names gained any momentum, such as bubbling or sparkling wine. The country's main holiday refreshment, champagne, would be served as a sort of warm-up, while being most appreciated for the cork flying out with a bang. People's favorites were sweet and semi-sweet champagne, with them sometimes settling for half-dry. Connoisseurs would prefer Soviet champagne with medals as opposed to the vignette variety, colloquially named Three Worms. The earliest of the Russian champagnes, Abro, Durso, and Novy Svet, which had real corks, were mostly exported and were available domestically pretty much only in the Black Sea region. The hardcore drinkers would mockingly call any sort of sparkling light alcohol shampoo, as in all foam and no wallop. Appropriate only for beginners and first dates. Another drawback was the fact that not all recycling centers accepted champagne bottles, and even when they did, they'd demand to remove all of the foil. American musician Dean Reed laundered the American flag right in front of the White House, while claiming that it was smeared with Vietnamese blood. That act was greeted with slight disapproval in the USA and major approval in the USSR. That guy with the guitar who played cowboys in movies and exposed capitalism became our cherished friend and a true role model for young people. Dean Reed's appearance in the Russia Hall was overwhelmingly well received. When Dean Reed was asked whether he could be considered a protest singer, he requested that people regard him as a singer of love. This was one good-looking rebel, with girls going crazy over his song Elizabeth. Some of his blonde fangirls were in a rush to dye their hair, since this progressive American preferred brunettes.
I've lived a life that's full. I've traveled each and every highway, and more, much more than this, I did it my way.
With an astronomical run of 1,940,000 copies, a beige-gray 3-volume collection of Sergei Esenin's work comes out in Ogonyok as an attachment. With him being the last singer from the village and a fun-loving Moscow player, he finally receives full acknowledgement as the most popular classic and the most accessible poet. These 3 volumes were the typographical shores of the boundless river of the people's love. Esenin was up there with Pushkin contending for the title National Poet #1. And here we had all of Esenin for everybody to be able to find a song that they can appreciate. Maple bare foliage for intelligentsia evening gatherings. The Golden Grove dissuaded for those rowdy fans of folklore. Are you still alive, my dear old lady, where a Finnish knife was stuck underneath his heart? This was considered to be a prison poetry masterpiece. People would embark on pilgrimages to Konstantinovo in Ryazan province and to the second wing of the Astoria Hotel in Leningrad, formerly known as Angleterre, where Esenin committed suicide. Esenin's cloth image, where he looked like a cherubim with a pipe, was in just as high demand as Hemingway's portrait of the same type. Soviet commerce was exploring new, progressive operation schemes, with more and more self-serve stores popping up all around the country, and new ones being built solely to those standards. Traditional retail outlets, where you'd receive goods over the shelf, were being converted to fit the new system. The pinnacle of self-service was the supermarkets being built in the residential districts of the capital cities, intended to resemble what they had in the West. The most important thing in self-serve stores was packaging. Industrial packaging was underdeveloped back then, with cheese, butter, sausage, cottage cheese, grains, and pasta mostly being packed right inside the shop, behind a divider. Assuming they even had any of those in the first place. From the beginning of the 70s, all cities aside from the capitals and closed military towns suffered from a shortage of meat and milk products. USSR Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev meets with President Gamal Abdel Nasser. The car plant in Belarus begins production of a new mining truck called the Belaz, with a payload of up to 75 tons. The first ever 75-ton Belaz 549 mining truck has already left the experimental production line. Prior to that, Belaz produced trucks with a maximum capacity of 27 or 40 tons. 75 tons was equivalent to 4 freight cars. Belaz was now simply known as a gigantic dump truck with wheels taller than a human being. The 100th edition of the satirical news program Fitil, or Wick, comes out. This collection of sketches mocked the bureaucrats, roasted the red tapers, and destroyed half-assed workers. Along the way, they revealed issues with the cultural and livelihood servicing of Yamal's state deer farms and ragged on the Nieman shoe factory. People grew accustomed to watching Fitil. The audience always got excited when the opening sequence appeared, which showed a box with a Bickford fuse. All of the other Soviet newsreels were black and white and boring. This criticism, which had approval from authorities, had a 100% success rate. Considering this newsreel was combating certain unusual phenomena, anyone who was caught on tape was picked apart as a lesson to everybody else. The top portion of the blacklist was compiled by Fitil editor-in-chief Sergei Mikhalkov, who was tight-knit with Soviet leadership. But what does Deputy Minister Comrade Vaskin have to say about this? That's what the narrator would tend to say in his smooth voice, and those words would terrify Deputy Minister Comrade Vaskin. To be honest, I disapprove of pretty much any sort of bender. It's no good, I'm telling you. They're going to meet adequate resistance very soon. Can you buy us a bottle of red wine, please? You want some red wine? Yeah, a bottle of red wine. You can hardly call this kind of behavior fighting back. Yo, guys, what brand do you drink? Armenian. Armenian. We prefer Armenian. And this is the man who spoke out against drinking with such conviction. Mikhalkov would receive a state prize for Fitil, while Fitil would become the name of a movie theater in Moscow. Two socialist nations replaced their party leaders due to their health condition. However, circumstances did vary. At first, a stormy occurrence in Poland becomes the reason for holding a plenary meeting on Christmas, but then the country transitions into the new year with a new Central Committee First Secretary. After that, the main organizational matter is brought up in East Germany, to be resolved in good spirit. Walter Ulbricht's professor-like beard created the illusion of him being a liberal university type, when in fact Comrade Ulbricht was a hardcore Bolshevik. He left office due to his elderly age of 78, with a decorative position called party chairman invented specially for him. Erich Honecker would become the new first secretary, him being 20 years younger than his predecessor. He appeared to be a much more promising candidate given the latest developments in the relations between the socialist bloc and West Germany. At the very end of 1970, Poland's leader Władysław Gomułka, under the guise of a new system of material incentives, drastically increased prices for coal, produce, and manufactured goods. People living on Poland's traditionally consolidated North Shores left their jobs and poured out onto the streets. In a few years, the entire world would see all of this depicted in Andrzej Wajda's film Man of Iron. Gomułka sanctioned a forceful crackdown on these protests. In Gdansk, 45 people were killed, with dozens injured. The situation was declared a national emergency. Gomułka, who wasn't able to properly handle the situation, was forced to retire due to bad health, with Eduard Gierek appointed as head of the party. In March of 1971, thanks to a long-term Soviet loan, he was able to roll back coal and produce prices and temporarily defuse the situation in the north. Now Poland was regarded as the socialist bloc's main troublemaker. Three-button shirts became the latest must-have addition to any man's wardrobe. The rest of the world called them polo shirts. Meanwhile, our word was bobochka. You couldn't find these on the open market. You had to source them, get them from speculators, or if you got lucky, you could find one in a thrift store. The first true polos were made in Italy, out of thin wool, and later cotton shirts would appear. Aside from Italy, high-quality shirts were also made in Hungary. Production of synthetic polo shirts, typically dark blue or maroon-colored, would later begin in Poland and Romania. Most people would prefer long-sleeved models, sweatshirts. As for the short-sleeved items, elderly gentlemen would prefer polo shirts with a weird image on them, such as a ship or an anchor on the pocket. 23 years prior to the events in question, when the nation of Israel was only being established, it was either Yekaterina Voroshilova who said to Polina Molotova, or vice versa, that now we too have our own motherland. In 1971, permission was granted for Soviet Jews to migrate to Israel, in the name of reuniting families. The decision was made by the Politburo, after the KGB suggested it was a good idea, while adding that it wouldn't come at a great cost. First of all, it was thought that not too many people would migrate, and even then those people would be from the western regions. Second, that it wouldn't affect the situation in the country in general. In 1971, approximately 15,000 people left the country. As for the official reunion of families claim, this was forgotten by the counter-propaganda campaign which immediately unfolded. Those who left legally were put on the same level as those who left illegally and labeled as traitors. The motherland would send them angry rebuttals from those who decided to stay, while unofficially forbidding the term Jew. The meetings that were held bore names such as Meetings of Soviet Citizens of Jewish Nationality. Soviet Jews do not and never will have anything in common with the Israeli bourgeoisie. Who asked the Israeli instigators to take care of us, Soviet citizens? Who gave them the right to speak on behalf of the Jewish people of our country? It's not entirely clear what exactly motivated Soviet leadership when they made the decision to allow the mass departure of Jews to Israel. Then again, one reason is clear. It's all down to pressure from the United States pro-Israel lobby, together with subtle requests on behalf of President Nixon to take that pressure into account. Anti-Semitic attitudes very well might have played a role, as well as the desire to give those who were dissatisfied the opportunity to leave. Whatever the case, when the Jews started their departure, that led to an increase in anti-Semitism, while the remaining Jews wound up in a difficult situation. Despite the fact that the mass departure of Jews was put to a halt in 1973, in retaliation to the U.S. Congress passing the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, the psychological and political grounds for future waves of migration emerged regardless. There is a certain saying in our country, which goes that the motherland is your home both by right of birth and upbringing. I reckon I'll speak for all of those present in saying that we don't and can't have any other motherland except for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The long-standing unofficial anti-Semitism gains legal underpinnings, as in if you leave, you won't pay up for the best college education in the world that you received, so the amount of Jews admitted to the most prestigious universities is limited, albeit unofficially. The fifth item in one's personal dossier, nationality, becomes the defining factor in one's career path. Half-bloods are carefully vetted. Some insisted that my passport says I'm Russian. When it came to human resource policy in regards to Jews, the elderly would be left alone, and youths wouldn't be nominated. Scary stories would be told about life in Israel, with instances of people returning being especially savored. Common folk would tend to label those who left and then came back as 2 times Jew of the Soviet Union. Here we are in a foreign country, with no rights or citizenship. Our situation is no different than that of slaves. You can see for yourselves what has become of us. This is the Sachnat International Jewish Agency headquarters in Jerusalem. Soviet Jews were migrating to an almost socialist nation compared to other countries of the world. Plenty of people heard kibbutzes being compared to collective farms. Impoverished inhabitants received no support from Israel. Only the poorest of the migrants received welfare. The state would grant them apartments virtually for free, 1 per family from the Sachnat, with 1 table, 2 or 3 stools, or 2 to 3 chairs if you were lucky. Each member of the family received an armored mesh bed and a blanket. Even among the first 15,000, there were those who departed using a fake invitation. People who were choosing between close relatives in the distant Far East town of Birobidzhan or distant relatives located a bit closer in the Middle East. The Jews were the first people in the USSR who received an opportunity to legally choose their country of residence. While en route to Israel with an overlay in Vienna, thousands of people instead of the Promised Land would opt for the USA, France, or West Germany. Their nationality gave them the right to turn down socialism. However, the leaders of 2 superpowers agreed on the need for initiating a dialogue. 1971 was the year of the 24th Congress of the Communist Party. Its protocol officially declared the successful construction of developed socialism in the USSR. During that Congress, a peace program was passed, which marked the beginning of Brezhnev's glory as the man who fought for de-escalation. The proposition included simultaneously dismantling the Warsaw Pact and NATO, while subsequently disbanding their military structures, liquidating all of their military bases, primarily in Central Europe, permanently acknowledging border changes as a result of World War II, summoning a conference between the 5 nuclear powers with the goal of outlawing nuclear weapons, among other things. Even despite this program being declarative, Brezhnev, who initiated an active dialogue with leading Western politicians, was recognized around the world as a rather respectable figure. There were much more enthusiasts in the USSR than in the rest of the world proposing their own method for saving the Leaning Tower of Pisa. That tower, which is part of a cathedral complex in the Italian town of Pisa, was under construction from the 12th to the 14th century. Its lean was attributed to a weak foundation combined with muddy soil. For example, here we have a student from Barnaul named Yevgeny Strazdin. He suggested laying a gigantic reinforced concrete disc onto the ground surrounding the foundation. Load would be transferred to it via a system of metal beams built into the tower's structure. Yevgeny submitted his project for a contest on ways to save the Tower of Pisa. Soviet experts assume that a project submitted by a student from Barnaul is interesting both from a scientific and practical standpoint. Southerners were a common sight on the Soviet stage. Meanwhile, there was an obvious lack of those representing the far north. That shortage was partially compensated by singer Nikolai Beldy, who assumed a stage name with a more explicit national flavor, Kola Beldy. With his song Reindeer Are a Better Way, he immediately became the embodiment of a Chukchi in the eyes of the Soviet people, despite him being of Nanayan origin.
Скажем для примера, ни борьбы за место нет и ни милиционера. За спиной летит снежок, мчатся нарты круче. Паровоз хорошо, пароход хорошо, самолет ничего, а олени лучше.
While the hunters were loading their rifles, 1971 was the year of the fight for Angela Davis's freedom. She was an African-American U.S. Communist Party activist and a professor at the University of California. She was charged with accessory to murder and arrested. We saw this as political persecution and stood up in her defense. It all began with California Governor Ronald Reagan's attempts to expel Angela Davis from the university's faculty for her obvious communist views and public support of terrorist organizations. Davis hired a bodyguard who was affiliated with the terrorists. During a court hearing, he tried to free his own. However, he was shot down by the police, and it turned out his pistol was registered under Davis's name. After 1.5 months of searching, the FBI arrested her in a New York City hotel. This particular story was avoided by the Soviet press. However, pieces on public protests were published daily, as well as resolutions from meetings against the unfair trial of the African-American communist who had been persecuted for her progressive views. A court in the city of San Rafael declares Angela Davis not guilty. The USSR would greet her with applause, with her later receiving an International Lenin Prize for strengthening the peace among comrades. In 1970, the Vaz automobile plant begins production of a new breed of domestic compact car. And in 1971, they become the country's most popular cars. The name Zhiguli, of course, was derived from the famous mountain range. But it turned out that that name was inappropriate for foreign markets, since it sounded too much like gigolo, which is why they would be exported under the name Lada. Zhigulis went on sale fairly recently. But have you taken notice how drastically they've changed our lives? There it is, right before us. Elegant, comfortable, and in some situations even sporty. This is the most popular car in the entire country. Here we have the first ever Vaz 2101 in the factory museum in Tolyatti, namely the first example sold through the trade network. The car was purchased by an employee of the Tolyatti cement engineering plant. In 19 years' time, upon receiving a proposal from Vaz's Labor Collective Council, he traded this relic in for a new car. Following the tradition of the time, this car's owner would tend to drive around until the first snow, at which point he'd carefully clean it off and place it in his garage for winter storage. The earliest cars were true Fiats. Together with the factory, they purchased 1,500 kits. So in this particular vehicle, only the labor was ours, as in stamping, welding, and assembly, while all of the parts that constituted this car were Italian, from the engine to the seats. The Vaz 2101, nicknamed Kopek, was basically a Fiat 124, which received the title World Car of the Year in 1965. The Vaz 2101 spawned an entire line of cars. It would soon be followed up by the Vaz 2103, the trendy 3 with plenty of chrome elements, then the 21011 with a slightly beefed-up motor, and then the 2106. Later, the 05 and 07 would appear with their boxy styling and rectangular headlights. Each modification had its own engine, interior trim, and price, though essentially they were all the same car. Apparently that's why enthusiasts would try to distinguish their cars with the help of accessories. Steering wheel covers, seat skins, mirror ornaments, pillows, toys, FIFA soccer balls underneath the rear glass. All of this would come into and go out of fashion. The construction of a car factory in Tolyatti was one of the most successful economic projects realized during the final 2 decades of the Soviet economy's existence. They put up the factory itself, and it started churning out decent quality automobiles. Well, at least by Soviet standards. They changed the lives of millions of Soviet families. They became the object of dreams. That said, this project reflects all of the properties inherent to the Soviet economy. After decades of industrialization, we purchased a factory with a comprehensive set of foreign-made equipment, which we paid for with our oil money. Then we built a factory which produces a car considered decent by Soviet standards, but was already obviously outdated as soon as production began. We were lagging behind since the factory's very first year of operation, with the gap increasing over time. We produced cars which from the very beginning would cost about 4 average annual salaries. This wasn't something you could call a popular consumer product. This was very much a luxury item. And that's exactly how people treated them. Leonid Engibarov, the saddest clown around, reveals his most joyful sideshow in 1971. Reels. Balancing on 5 reels was a huge achievement in equilibristics. Holding your balance is always relevant. Rewarding yourself is already relevant. Now, this was an unbelievably daring hint. Engibarov, being a master of eloquent silence, never said a single word in the arena. For the first time, the venue hosted not a comical but rather a tragic clown. Engibarov would be referred to in the press as a clown with autumn in his heart. Badminton, the latest urban pastime. It wasn't so much a sport as it was a way to spend leisure time. The players wouldn't use a net in such a case. You could play this game anywhere, on the beach, in the country, the forest, in your yard, and even on the sidewalk. Only advanced players would use a net. They'd also use Lastochka brand rackets made of metal, and Chinese-made feather shuttlecocks. Meanwhile, the majority of people would use wooden rackets, together with domestic-made plastic shuttlecocks. The massive popularity of badminton wasn't even hampered by the wind. People would put rocks inside their shuttlecocks to keep them from veering too far off course. Back then, Nikita Sergeyevich was first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine. The entire country knew the acronym SCB, or Student Construction Brigades. Students were already going to construction sites, but now the movement gains universal status. This sort of vacation would be called a third labor semester. All healthy students would spend at least a month every year working in construction. The typical green jacket uniform was recognized by both the youth fashion and military faculties. To further the military associations, these jackets were usually accompanied by a striped shirt and an army belt. Farming was the least enticing activity. As for the most lucrative, that would have to be building cowsheds and narrow railroads in the Komi Republic. The quality of student labor was pretty low, but limited rural construction resources meant there wasn't much of a choice. As for the most profitable brigades, those were legalized gangs who were after the big cash up north, which would be joined even by university professors. Another space catastrophe which happened during routine research. The entire crew of the Soyuz 11 died upon returning from orbit. Cosmonauts Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev. Their mission was to aid in building the long-acting Salyut space station. While they were on their way back to Earth, a valve separating the cabin from the atmosphere opened up, which led to depressurization. In just 42 seconds, Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev died. The cosmonauts' blood had boiled. The nation was in painful disbelief, as in maybe we should stop sending people to space. The theater of the country's main puppeteer, Sergei Obraztsov, moved into a new building, the facade of which was adorned with a magical clock. It became Moscow's newest attraction and a mandatory stop during tours around the capital city. Obraztsov's clock plays in the grove or in the garden in composer Bogoslavsky's rendition. 12 different birdhouses inhabited by fauna from fairy tales. Sister Fox, Boxthorn Goat, Toptigan, Puss in Boots, Running Rabbit. People would spend hours gazing at the clock. At the top of every hour, one of those fictional characters would greet the crowd, sliding out thanks to an electric motor. The rabbit would come out at 5, the wolf at 11. In 1971, French perfume finds its way onto the USSR open market. 25 rubles bought you a bottle of Klima. Later they would add Fiji, Chanel, as well as Bulgarian, Polish, and Arabian knockoffs. Women living in cities yearned for French perfume, it being an incredibly valuable gift from their men, since they smelled of sanctioned bourgeoisie luxury. France was all about Paris, and Paris was thought to be a magical place where glamour, style, and beauty reigned supreme. French perfume was what made a French woman, the unattainable standard for Soviet ladies, and the greatest possible prize catch for Soviet men. The words "my French wife" had more to them than even "my dad is a minister." From the late 60s and onward, Marina Vladi would often spend time in Moscow. The French actress of Russian descent was adored in our parts, thanks to her lead role in the movie The Blonde Witch. Vladi had a role in a short sketch by Yutkevich, and she attended the Moscow Film Festival every time it was held. But soon the country would find out the main reason for such frequent visits. The relationship between Marina Vladi and Vladimir Vysotsky led to the famous French woman getting married to Russia's #1 male celebrity. Just like Tereshkova and Nikolaev in the 60s, in the 70s Vladi and Vysotsky were the star couple of the decade. A series of photos taken by Valery Plotnikov. Here's a clip from the movie Seven Old Men and a Girl. A government official who attends physical therapy has his dream come true in the form of a bride from France, who he's about to present to his colleagues. Hello. Good day to you. I'd like you to meet my bride.
Bonjour, madame. Bonjour, monsieur. Vous vous êtes fâché de moi, n'est-ce pas?
What did she just say?
Pourquoi?
A relationship with a French girl means being separated all the time. However, she will return to take her Russian lover with her and live a new life together with a man who had already been transformed by their breathtaking romance.
Voilà. Très bien. Pardon, madame. Pardon, monsieur.
Pardon.
To see Paris and die was a popular theme in Russian urban folklore. Back in the day, Ilya Ehrenberg, whilst combating stereotypes, tried to convince Soviet readers that nobody in Paris ever partied nights on end, and that after 10 o'clock in the evening you'd be hard-pressed to find a window where the lights were still on. But his efforts were in vain, and the legend about glamour, style, and beauty prevailed. The Paris that never was and doesn't exist still, well, thanks to all of the Francophiles working at our network, we've recreated it while keeping in line with the space-time aspect. So first off, that Paris was full of stylish gentlemen dressed in Cardin. We weren't aware of any other French designer back in 1971. Second of all, you simply couldn't get away from the scent of France's #1 perfume, Chanel No. 5. And third, everyone in Paris hung out at boulevard cafes with open porches, where they'd of course enjoy some champagne. The most well-known perfumes out of what appeared in the USSR in the 1970s were, of course, Chanel 5 and Fiji. Chanel was what you'd call an old-fashioned recipe. Classic perfume with a sweet aroma, but very much appropriate for both summer and winter, given its freshening and warming effect. This was the sort of classic gold standard. As for Fiji, it had a bit more sweetness to it. It was more pungent. Personally, I heard from consultants that they were a great choice for women over 36 years of age. But that's not really what mattered. The main thing was their French origin. No more need be said. The country was sort of divided into two camps. Those who preferred Fiji and fans of Chanel. Soviet weightlifter Vasily Alekseev received his first gold medals in 1970. But now he had rightfully earned the title strongest man on the planet. Throughout the year 1971, Alekseev set a handful of new world records. Alekseev comfortably won an international tournament held in Paris. He set records in snatch at 177.5 kilos, while pushing a record 230 kilos in clean and jerk. Specialized filming techniques allow you to have a good look at how the clean and jerk world record was set. This is the 29th record set by the Soviet strongman. In 1971, universal postal indexing is implemented. From then on, in the lower left corner of an envelope, you'd find a grid for writing the recipient's local postal code. On the other side of the envelope, you had a template of how to write out the numbers. A huge part of our vast country communicated via mail. Telephone service, especially long distance, wasn't available to the masses, and so relatives living in different cities wrote each other letters for years on end. They'd also send each other a bunch of postcards right before the holidays. Those would now also have to be labeled with a postal code. Postal codes allowed for faster processing of mail. A postal code is basically a digitized address, which is decipherable by a machine. It was vital to fill in the dotted columns according to the template, which wasn't something everybody was able to do. A good proportion of letters sent within the country either had an improper code or lacked it altogether. The Ministry of Communication launched a massive propaganda campaign. Every post office had several banners with instructions, pamphlets with information were slipped into everybody's mailboxes. All entrances to apartment buildings now sported signs showing the digital address and reading, "Please provide your postal code to everyone you exchange letters with." 1971's top 20 songs would be played on the first day of 1972 during a farewell concert called Song of 1971. This was the first ever Song of the Year festival. The top 20 presentation was visited by the authors of that year's best pop songs, who were handed diplomas. They'd emphasized that the success of a song is mainly the composer's victory. Prize-winning songs both then and subsequently were determined not by the amount of copies sold, nor by the number of times they'd play them over the radio or on TV, but rather based on mail from the viewers. And that was 1971. Part of our series the other day, 1961 to 1991, current era. Next time we'll cover 1972. Gaz-69 replaced by the UAZ, Nixon's historic visit, Tyumen province becomes the country's main oil base, the Olympic Games in Munich, sausage issues, ensigns and midshipmen, games with the Canadian pros, a dry summer, 50 years since forming the USSR, jokes about Chukchi. See you for a new episode and a new year. Farewell.